Alright, hi guys, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Alexus and I am a 5th and final PhD student studying Biological Oceanography at the University of Hawaii at Mānoa. I make videos about demystifying the graduate school application process as well as my life as a PhD student in Hawaii. Today we'll be diving into the Graduate Research Plan Statement for the NSF GRFP application. This is your opportunity to present a research proposal that could define your graduate school experience, and I'll be going over some ways to structure your statement as well as highlighting key elements that should be in there, and also going over my own example of my graduate research plan statement that earned me the NSF GRFP Fellowship in 2022. If you would like to learn more information about the NSF GRFP program or need some help on the personal statement component of your application, then go check out these other two videos that I've done on those topics after this video. Let's start by looking at the prompt for this research statement. So you'll be asked to present an original research topic that you'd like to pursue in graduate school, and the page limit for this research statement plan is only 2 pages, which can be a little bit challenging, I think. And the NSF guidelines ask you to describe the research idea, your general approach, as well as any unique resources that may be needed for accomplishing the research goal. So they want to make sure that you have the resources necessary to conduct this research. You may also include important literature citations, and you want to address the potential of your research to advance 1, scientific knowledge, and 2, the potential for your research to benefit society, which we're calling broader impacts. So this might feel a little bit daunting, especially if you don't have a concrete plan for your graduate research yet, but that's completely okay. It's very important to note that this statement doesn't have to be set in stone on exactly what you're going to be doing in graduate school. You actually aren't even tied to doing the research that you write about in your statement. It's simply an opportunity for you to really showcase your potential to conduct research that is creative, original, and impactful. So the first step before writing your research statement is going to be first choosing a research field or topic and choosing a research project that you can write about. So if you're already a graduate student in a program, then it might be a little bit easier for you to come up with a research project that is closely related to your area of expertise, your program, or what your lab or research group already does, and you can kind of build off of that. For me, I applied as a second-year graduate student, which is basically the last opportunity that you can apply for this fellowship. And it was my first time applying, but I had a very good sense of what my dissertation research would be about. So it was really just about refining my research questions, hypotheses, and working out exactly how I'll be testing those hypotheses. I did find it a bit challenging to stay within the 2-page limit as a graduate student because I knew a lot about my research area, why it was important, and the different data types that I had access to. So it was really about just refining to a few research questions and like the most important hypotheses that I wanted to answer, or the ones that I thought were going to be the most original, innovative, and impressive to the reviewers reading these applications. But if you're not already a graduate student, then putting together this research proposal can be a bit more challenging. And ideally, you'd want to find some sort of mentor that can help you writing this research proposal. Maybe your mentor can be a faculty member, a postdoc, or a graduate student, or just another professional that you worked with that has knowledge in this area and can assist you with putting together an excellent research proposal. If that is not possible, then you can try speaking to faculty members that are at the different graduate school programs that you're applying to. If you're a really good grad school candidate with plenty of research experience and a good academic history and are interested in doing work that aligns with that professor, then maybe they'll consider working on an application with you if you're that promising of a candidate. But it can also be useful to just interview and speak with some other scientists or professionals in that field and ask them questions like, if you had all the money in the world and all of the resources, what questions would you pursue next? What are the knowledge gaps in that field? To kind of get a sense of where the field that you're interested in is going or headed in the future. That can be extremely helpful, even if they don't want to mentor you throughout this writing process. And it's completely okay if you don't have a mentor for this research statement. That just means that you're going to have to do a lot of the work in finding a research topic and questions that are interesting and methods that you can go about answering those research questions. So looking at the literature, see what other people are doing, look at the future directions and their limitations. So what can you do as a next step? How can you improve upon the already existing research? So really, it's all about your ability to craft a project that shows your readiness to take on graduate level research, even if you haven't even started it yet. And just as a side note, it's also important to know that if you're applying as someone who has not been in a graduate program yet, then you'll be in a completely different category and reviewed separately from the first year graduate students and the second year graduate students. So you don't have to worry about being an undergrad or during your gap year and competing with someone who already is in a graduate research program and has an idea of their dissertation topic. Okay, so now that we have reviewed the prompt and hopefully you have an idea of your research topic or project, we can now get into how to actually structure and write the research statement. So the first step is to come up with a research title for your project. And ideally, it should be clear, memorable, and should not have too much jargon. And it should immediately tell the reviewers what your project is going to be about. So for example, for my graduate research plan statement, my title was Mining the Deep, Assessing Sediment Plume Impacts on Midwater Pelagic Zooplankton. And I wouldn't say that this is like the most memorable or like catchy title, but it at least doesn't have too much jargon and gives them a sense of what I'll be writing about, which is deep sea mining impacts on zooplankton in midwater ecosystems. Okay, so following your title, you're going to have your introduction. So this is going to be your background and your problem statement. It should take up about 1/4 of a page to 1/2 of a page. And here you can see that in mine, I've dedicated 2 whole paragraphs to this section. Basically, you'll be introducing and explaining what the big picture problem is that your research is addressing. And you'll also want to talk a little bit about why should we even care about this research that you're doing? Why is it important to us? You'll want to identify any knowledge gaps in the current state of this field, how your research will fill those knowledge gaps, and why it's important that those gaps are filled or addressed. Lastly, this is very important. You want to make sure that your project is original, novel, creative, innovative, and transformative. So let's take a quick look at what I wrote for this section. So mine was about deep sea mining impacts on midwater zooplankton. So I explain the problem, which is deep sea mining for polymetallic nodules. I say why we should care about this. It will create large-scale disturbances to both the sea floor and midwater ecosystems. It's a particularly understudied aspect of environmental impact because at this point, a lot of people were focusing on disturbances to the sea floor, but not really disturbances to the middle of the water column, where basically the dirty water will be re-released back into the ocean. It's important because full-scale mining operations are expected to begin in the next 5 years. I introduced the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, which is my site. I also mentioned that mining will be occurring in an ecosystem with a pronounced oxygen minimum zone, where oxygen concentrations are already very, very low, and organisms have adapted to living very close to their physiological limits. Then I have a second paragraph on a little bit more specifically about my research and what exactly I'll be looking into. So I mention a critical knowledge gap, impacts of this mining on pelagic zooplankton. I mention what zooplankton are and why they are important. So I say key players in the biological pump, which is important for like food webs. I mention why we should be studying zooplankton compared to other marine organisms by making the point that they are near the base of the food web and feed directly on particles at depth. So this can cause bottom-up effects or biomagnification of toxic elements. They're good organisms to study because they have short generation times and are likely to show population-level responses within days to weeks of this mining. I mentioned some of the effects that deep-sea mining and these sediment plumes can have on zooplankton specifically. So like clogging their feeding structures, diluting food for suspension feeders, and changing their buoyancy if sediments stick to the sticky gelatinous zooplankton. And here at the very end, I'm bolding what exactly am I going to be doing in answering this like deep sea mining problem. So here I'm actually restating the 2 aims that I came up with that I'm going to be addressing throughout the rest of my research statement. So 1, evaluating how the vertical structure and community composition changes, and 2, examining zooplankton uptake of trace metals resulting from sediment plume release. So once you introduce your topic and the problem statement, the next section is going to be your actual research plan. So this should be about 1 to 1 1/4 page, and it should contain the following sections. So you want to clearly outline your research question, your study system or organism, research aims, hypotheses, methods, and analyses that will be conducted. So first you want to clearly state your research question that you're going to be answering and its significance to advancing the field. So in my research statement, I feel like I don't have a section for the research question, but I have the detailed sentence of the aims and how it relates to the question that I'm trying to answer above. So I would consider that where I'm showing the research question. So in my writing, that is the best example where I can find where I'm clearly stating my research question and aims that I'm trying to answer. Then you want to introduce your study system or organism that you're going to be talking about. And in this section, it's really important that you also include the qualifications of your potential graduate school advisor, their lab and resources that will be available to you in order to prove or support the fact that you will be able to conduct this research given the graduate school program that you're applying to as part of this research statement. So we can look at my example a little bit further and how I do this. So you can see that I have a paragraph relating to this study system that I'm going to be talking about. I mention the objectives of these cruises the area in which it's happening. I mentioned that I will have spring and fall cruises and a third test mining cruise. I mentioned that I have 2 sites. I mentioned how zooplankton were collected while at sea using 2 different net systems and the depths that I was looking at. I have day and night to capture migration behaviors, a little bit of detail about the test mining operations and where the sediment plume will be released, and importantly, I mention that this research will be conducted in my PI's lab, just so that they know I'm doing this as part of a lab group and which university. So your next step is going to be identifying your research aims. And you can have multiple research aims, maybe anywhere from 1 to 3, as long as they relate back to the research question that you mentioned earlier. So going back to my writing, I have 2 aims that I mention early on in the statement towards the end of my introduction or background. And these 2 aims come up again later in the research statement, and I've separated them. So you can see aim 1 is looking at the vertical structure and community composition, and aim 2 is looking at uptake of trace metals. So that's how I've separated my 2 different aims that both relate to the question of how are zooplankton affected by these sediment plumes resulting from deep sea mining activity. Next, for each aim, you want to present 1 to 2 testable and clear hypotheses. And if you have multiple hypotheses, they should kind of logically build off of each other. And I'll show you my example of my hypotheses. So going to aim 1, my first hypothesis is that zooplankton shown plume avoidance behavior as an adaptive behavioral response, altering their depth distribution and migration patterns to reduce exposure to highly impacted regions of the water column. Hypothesis 2 is that gelatinous, soft-bodied, particle-feeding taxa are more negatively impacted by these plumes than other members of the zooplankton assemblage. And my third hypothesis, which relates to aim 2, is that small-bodied, particle-feeding zooplankton are the primary point of entry for mining-derived trace metals into the pelagic food web. So all of these are highly specific and can be tested given the methods that I present later. So once you've identified your research question, aims, and testable hypotheses, the next step is going to be presenting the methods that you're going to be using to test your hypotheses. So for each hypothesis, you should have methods that go along with it that directly answer the hypothesis that you mention. You want to give a brief overview of the methods that will be used to test your hypothesis, as well as how you will break down those different methods and key steps in year 1, year 2, and year 3 of your NSF GRFP Fellowship. So making it very clear which steps you will take when. It is also good to mention how you will assess success in using these methods and answering your hypotheses or research questions, and how you will deal with any difficulties that may arise while you're doing this research. And it's very important to also highlight any collaborations that you might use to support your development of certain skills in order to accomplish this research. You want to mention any resources that you have access to and can take advantage of while doing your research, and really highlight and stress the importance of this research, why it's creative, novel, innovative, and transformative. And while I didn't use any figures or diagrams in my research statement, some people have, and this could be a good idea if you have some complex or abstract idea that you're trying to illustrate through a figure. Then after the methods, you want to talk about the analyses that you're going to be using. You want to be specific about how you will analyze the data, which significance tests or models you will run. If you're developing a model or tool that can be used by others in your field, mention that and be specific about how they can use it or how what you're doing is going to make it easier for other people. And also you want to mention how you're going to develop all of these analytical or like computational skills that you need in order to conduct your analysis. So what kind of trainings will you take, or like courses, or maybe just working with your PI? But let's take a look at what I wrote in my research statement. Okay, real quick, if you're getting any value out of this video, can you please give it a big like? It really helps me as we're trying to grow the channel and getting the right people to see this video. And subscribe if you would like to see more content about graduate school and life as a PhD student in Hawaii. So if we look at the first aim, you can see I have the aim, hypotheses, as well as the methods. And I've separated the methods into subsections, which are collection, which mentions how I'm going to be collecting my zooplankton samples. Community composition, how I will be looking at which zooplankton are making up the community. I mentioned metabarcoding using 2 genes. Then I mention how I will look at diversity using different indices and how I will quantify biomass through wet and dry weight measurements. And then here at the very end, you can see that I mentioned the statistical analyses that I will do that relate back to my hypothesis that will tell me whether or not this hypothesis is supported or rejected. So I mentioned a per MANOVA, including environmental variables using NMDS, and clustering analysis to visualize how community structure changes with site and mining impacts. Then again, for my second hypothesis, I also have a methods section where I mention how I'm going to specifically test that hypothesis. I mention here in year 2, I will use the ZooScan, and then I mention the methods that are relevant to the ZooScan and how I'll use it and combine it with metabarcoding data to describe which taxa decline in abundance or biomass in regions impacted by plumes. And now that I'm looking here, I didn't include any statistical analyses, and maybe that was a mistake. Maybe that's how this section could be improved. But ideally, you want to mention your methods as well as how you will analyze the data after generating it. Okay, let's look at my second aim and my last hypothesis. Again, I have another method section that directly relates to how I'm testing hypothesis number 3. And I mention in year 3, so I'm breaking it down by what I will be doing in each year. I will measure trace metal concentrations. I will focus on these trace metals, and I will be collaborating with this ecotoxicology professor at this university, and I give some specifics of exactly which methods will be used. And I tie it back to my hypothesis. So I say, if my hypothesis is correct, I predict that zooplankton sample during test mining, especially the small-bodied particle-feeding taxa, will have higher concentrations of trace metals compared to baseline studies. So this is going back to the fact that you want to tie your results back to your hypothesis, like which result will indicate that your hypothesis is supported versus rejected. And you just want to do some thinking about what you expect and what that means for your results. What are they going to look like? Okay, so following your research plan from your research question all the way down to your analyses, the next 2 sections are going to be intellectual merit as it relates to your research and broader impacts as it relates to your research. And you should have a separate section for each, and they should both be about 1/4 of a page. So for intellectual merit, you really want to highlight the impact or significance of your research. So how is your research going to be used to expand scientific knowledge in the area? What aspects of it make it creative, innovative, novel, or transformative? And also, once you conduct this research, how are you going to get your research findings out into the world? So how will you publish or present this data? So if we look at my example, for intellectual merit, I straight out say that this project is novel because it threatens one of the few remaining pristine habitats on our planet. So that makes it sound like it's really, really important, right? I stress again that deep sea mining is going to be happening soon, within the next 5 years, and my research will be among the first, why it's important, to examine impacts on midwater animals. I mentioned how it's going to further our knowledge of the area. So results will allow us to understand this, and understanding how zooplankton take up trace metals will provide us with insights about trophic ecology, which is important because fish and other micronecton that rely on zooplankton form our human seafood supply. So that's why we should care. And in addition, I have the unique opportunity to describe new species, so novel, from below 3,000 meter depth, which hasn't been sampled that much. So that's why mine is new, novel information. I mentioned that I will submit these results to the International Seabed Authority, which sets regulations for mining. So that's the clear impact that my research is going to be having in the real world. And for the scientific community, I will present my results, and I'm specific at the Ocean Sciences meeting in February 2020, and that I will actively publish papers throughout my PhD, and I'm specific about 2 target journals that I might publish in. So even though I haven't published these papers or given these talks, I'm being very specific about where I'm going to be presenting and which journals I might be submitting to. Okay, so the last section of your graduate research plan statement is going to talk about your broader impacts as it relates to your research. So what is the big picture statement about how your research specifically benefits society or impacts society in some way? So again, this is basically, why is your research important? Why should we care about it? And what problem are you trying to solve? Because you're probably not just doing this research for the fun of it. You're doing it because there's a problem that needs solving, and there's ways that your research can be applied to the real world that will benefit society. So they want to know all of that. And in addition to your research, you should also mention a broader impacts initiative or project that you can conduct that links to your research or research field. So for example, this can look like building mentorship programs, doing science outreach and education on your graduate research topic. So sharing your research with a wider audience, or maybe certain workshops that you can conduct, such as like a teacher workshop that teaches teachers about the deep sea and how they can create lesson plans around like deep sea biology that they can implement into their science classes. Whatever it is, you want to make sure that this broader impact initiative is doable and feasible for a graduate student with the resources that are available to you. And it is also okay to collaborate or expand on existing programs as long as you're describing the new role that you will be taking in those existing programs. So now let's look at my example of my broader impacts. I say this research will have 3 primary broader impacts. 1 is to submit these results to the International Seabed Authority to inform regulatory and management decisions. 2, I will engage with the Pew Charitable Trust and other NGOs to inform the public about deep sea mining and advocate for the protection of these ecosystems. And 3, I will broaden participation in STEM and facilitate opportunities for mentored research by pairing GES and OSTEM undergrads with UH Mentorship Alliance graduate mentors conducting similar deep sea or zooplankton research. And I say, see my personal statement. So the first 2 are more the direct, broader impacts resulting from doing research in this area. Like 1, naturally, these results that I'm collecting will be passed to the ISA, and I'll have opportunities to inform the public about why we need to care about deep sea mining and advocating for the protection of these ecosystems, whereas the last one ties into more of the mentorship programs that I talk about in more detail in my personal statement. So even though that seems like just very briefly mentioned here, I dive into more detail about how I will go about that mentorship program in my personal statement, which I would highly recommend tying your broader impacts from this into the broader impacts that you mentioned for your future goals and action plan section of your personal statement, just so everything seems cohesive and they know what things are important to you, and so there's common themes between both of your statements. You want them to support each other. Okay, so just a final note. For the research statement, you might need to cite literature, and given that space is limited and you only have 2 pages, you want to cite it using an abbreviated citation. You can see that throughout my text, I have my citations as superscripts. So I have 1, 2, 3, and I think 4 citations throughout my whole thing, which are either related to the introduction and the background that people need to understand in order to understand my topic of deep sea mining, and a second one that is more specific about the methods that I want to be using to look at trace metals. All of those are cited below. There are 4 citations that only take up 2 lines. So I have the superscript number, the author's last name, first name, only the first author, so they're all et al., the year, and the abbreviation of the journal that it was published in. It's really just the least information possible that they need in order to find the citation. So first author's last name, initials, year it was published, and abbreviation for the journal. And if you're unsure on how a journal is abbreviated, you can just quickly look it up. Sometimes it's not very straightforward. And whatever you do for citations, it's very important that you keep it consistent throughout your research statements. Okay, so that is it for today's video. I hope you found these tips on how to write your graduate research plan statement for the NSF GRFP helpful. If you have more questions about the NSF GRFP or want to see more tips on how to apply, then let me know below in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more graduate school application content and life as a PhD student in Hawaii.